The Holy Gospel according to St. John, the 6th chapter. Glory to you, Lord. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for all these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land towards which they were going. The Gospel of the Lord. So, the story of the feeding of the 5,000 is actually a unique miracle story. It is unique because it is the only miracle story, the only story of any miracle Jesus ever performs that is recorded in all 4 of the Gospels. No other miracle story, not even the ones in which Jesus raises somebody from the dead, is remembered and recorded by all 4 evangelists. So it becomes absolutely unique. This was the story that everybody seemed to remember. But as I was thinking about this story again this week, it occurred to me that it's unique for another reason as well. It's unique because it seems like it's an unnecessary miracle. I mean, in every other miracle story, somebody is clearly in need. Maybe somebody is sick. Maybe somebody is possessed by demons. Maybe somebody can't walk or they can't see. But in every other miracle story, it's obvious that somebody is in distress, and sometimes they themselves, the people in distress, ask Jesus for help. But these 5,000 people who are coming towards Jesus, we're not even sure that they're hungry. I mean, John's Gospel begins by saying that these are crowds of people who have been following Jesus around the Sea of Galilee because they saw the signs that Jesus is doing for the sick. So if they're following Jesus around because they see the signs that he's doing for the sick, it's clear that these folks are not way out in the wilderness where there is no food, which is sometimes how we imagine this story. They are around the sea where there are villages all around the coast. And in fact, in other versions of this story, the disciples say to Jesus, well, if they're hungry, send them away to the towns. There's plenty of food there. They can find food. So it doesn't seem like it's a necessary miracle. If these folks have been following Jesus around because they've seen the signs that he's doing for the sick, it's probable that they have brought their sick friends or relatives with them. Because if Jesus is healing all these sick people, maybe they'll help their friends. Maybe they'll help their family members as well. That's why they're there. And if Jesus is being followed around because they have seen the signs that Jesus is doing for the sick and they've been learning something, maybe these folks are just there expecting Jesus to teach them and give them some good spiritual insight. In fact, that's how the story is set up. Jesus sees the crowds, he goes up the mountain, and he sits down. That is the traditional posture of teaching. People would have been expecting Jesus to then begin to teach. But that's not what happens. All of a sudden, Jesus himself brings up the idea of lunch. I mean, all of a sudden he says to Philip, hey, where are we going to get food to feed all these people? And Philip's like, food? Who said anything about food? We don't have any food here. Why would anybody? They're not even asking to be fed. But Jesus decides he's going to feed him. So he finds the boy that has the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, takes those 5 loaves, 2 fish, and begins to feed the crowd. And then when he's done, he asks the disciples to gather up all the fragments left over, and they fill 12 baskets full of all the broken fragments that are left over. But as far as we know, Jesus didn't teach the crowds anything that day. John doesn't mention anything about that. He didn't heal anyone. He just fed them. And then he had to retreat back up the mountain because they saw this sign and decided, hey, let's go take Jesus and make him king. And so he actually has to go up and hide away from the crowds. The whole thing seems like an absolutely unnecessary miracle. Why did Jesus do that? After all, it was unexpected in that nobody was asking Jesus for food in the first place. It was certainly surprising in that Jesus was able to feed so many people with so little food. And it may even have been distracting and confusing in that Jesus was addressing a problem different from the one that people would have been expecting him to address. And yet, this unexpected, surprising, and even distracting miracle was a key turning point in Jesus' ministry. It was through this event that Jesus was able to get people's attention in ways that he could not have if he had done the expected thing. Because after all, if Jesus had just healed people and taught people and done those kinds of things, people would have walked away and went, we went out to see Jesus and we saw the show we were expecting to see. Jesus healed some people and he taught some people, and they would have figured that Jesus would just continue to behave in very predictable, albeit miraculous ways. We just expect Jesus is going to work like this, and that's how it's going to happen. And, we're going to go out and see Jesus just like we would go to see a show. And we know what the show is about. We're going to see the show exactly the same way. But this was unexpected. This was weird. And maybe that is why it got remembered in all 4 of the Gospels, because it was not expected. It was through this event that Jesus was able to start a conversation about what bread really is. Because the whole thing centers around bread, and then for the next 65 verses, Jesus goes on and talks about bread, and I am the bread of life. And pastors hate it when we get to this point in the lectionary cycle, because every gospel reading for the next 6 weeks starts out with Jesus saying, I am the bread of life, and Jesus says, I am the bread of life. So Pastor Christine and I have to figure out how to preach on bread for the next 6 weeks, because Jesus is talking about bread. But here's the thing. When Jesus talks about bread with people, he's asking them to consider what actually is life-giving in their lives. And if something is actually life-giving, if God is actually life-giving, then he wants them to consider what it means to have a relationship with God, not simply what they can get from God. And that deep conversation could not have been started if this wasn't, in some respects, kind of surprising and even disorienting kind of event. And it was through this event that Jesus was able to refocus people away from the problem of the moment and maybe into a new way of living. See, these folks who came out, probably, they were looking for help for one of their friends or family members, and that was important. Or maybe they were looking for some words of encouragement and hope, and they needed that in their life at that particular moment. Who knows? Maybe a few of them were a little hungry and needed lunch. But sometimes it's so easy to get wrapped around the axle about whatever the crisis du jour is that you can't see the big picture. And maybe it took that unexpected, surprising, and even distracting event to be able to get people out of whatever the momentary crisis was, so that they could start to think about the bigger picture of what God was doing in their lives and in the life of the whole world. So I wonder if maybe one of the most important takeaways from this story is bigger than miracles or bread and fish, or even how God can do miraculously great things with seemingly nothing. Maybe one of the most important takeaways from this story is the reminder that we too should be alert to the unexpected, surprising, and sometimes even distracting things that God is sometimes doing in our lives. Because I know, at least for me, I am really, really good about telling God what exactly the problem is in my life or the life of the world. I'm really good about saying, this is the problem, and I'm very good at advising God about what I expect God to do about the problem and how God should fix the problem. And I tell myself that if God would just do that thing, then my life, the life of the world, would be okay, and kind of I could get back to business as usual. But am I open to Jesus addressing a problem that I did not ask him to address? Am I willing to be confronted by Jesus about something in my life that needs working on that I really don't want to work on? Or that I would just assume Jesus not ask me to deal with? Am I willing to do that? Are you? See, are we open to Jesus working in our lives in ways that we don't expect, that completely surprise us and that distract us from the issues that we've so often wrapped ourselves up in? Maybe for us too, the story of the feeding of the 5,000 is a reminder that sometimes Jesus' most important and impressive work among us are those moments when God does something absolutely unexpected and pulls us out of our ho-hum, yeah, this is what I expect God to do in my life, or frankly, this is what I don't expect God to be doing in my life. Whatever it is in our own personal theologies about who God is and how God works in our lives, at least I know for me, even when I try to parse this theology all the time and think about it, I expect God to work in certain ways and not to work in other ways, and Jesus becomes utterly predictable. I sort of expect this is how God works in my life. Not unlike the crowd who expected Jesus is going to heal some people here, and they're going to teach some people here, and then that's just sort of the way it works. Sometimes the times when God can really get my attention is when something happens that really, wait, is God doing this? That's not usually the way God works in my life. That's not usually the way, I'm not even sure that is God working in my life, but that surprising event could grasp me, kind of drag me out of the utter predictability that I so often get caught up in. And sometimes we ought to be open to those surprising events in our lives, those unexpected events, and wonder, is this God trying to get my attention? Is this God trying to show me something more? Because sometimes those are the events that are most important in our spiritual growth. Sometimes, like with those crowds, the story of the feeding of the 5,000 reminds us that sometimes the ways that God works in our lives are most important when they surprise us with an abundance of something that doesn't seem necessary at the moment. I mean, it doesn't seem like people needed all this bread, and Jesus gave it to them. And maybe sometimes it takes that abundance to drag us out of the sense of relative depravity that so often we live in. No matter how much we have, we always think about what we don't have or what we want. And sometimes people will come up to me, and maybe they come up to you too, and they want to remind me, look at how many friends you have. Look at how much good health you have. And they're like, yeah, I have all that great stuff there. But I don't have enough time, I don't have enough money, I don't have enough opportunity, all the things that I'm doing. And it's like, wait a minute. Maybe the abundance that I have of something that I didn't even think I needed a lot of, maybe that's a sign of God's abundance in my life. Maybe that's a sign that I have the resources to actually deal with the things that I don't have. That was the sign that Jesus was doing with the crowd that day. And sometimes that's a sign that Jesus does in our lives as well. And sometimes the most important and impressive work that Jesus is doing in our lives happens at those moments when we get distracted from the problems that we keep harping about, so that we can see the bigger pictures in our lives and in the life of the world around us. I know sometimes if this happens to me, maybe it happens to you too, I get really focused on I got to deal with this problem. Here's this problem, I got to deal with this problem. And it takes somebody pushing that away for me to kind of see the whole forest and not just the one tree. Maybe it is that sometimes that distraction, which often annoys me, is actually the thing that God needs me to do. And it probably was annoying to a few of those folks who came in that crowd, and Jesus says, "Hey, let's have food." And they're like, no, look, see, sick person. Deal with this first, then we can have lunch. But sometimes that distraction helps us to be able to see something bigger that God is doing in our own lives and in the life of the world. It's also important to remember that John's Gospel always calls miracles signs. He actually never uses the word miracle. And maybe that's because when somebody experiences a miracle, the reaction to miracle is often, "Oh wow, great, my problem is solved, and now I can get back to business as usual." But when Jesus does a sign like this, it isn't simply to solve a momentary problem, and nobody is supposed to go back to life as usual or business as usual. Instead, when Jesus performs a sign in the Gospels or in our lives, the sign is intended to lead us into a new reality by confronting us with the unexpected. It's intended to surprise us by opening us up to the abundance of God in our lives in spite of the problems we may be facing. And it's intended to distract us from the problems of our daily lives so that we can keep all of those problems and issues in perspective and see the bigger picture that God has in mind for us and for the life of the whole.